The first email was an annoyance, a gnat buzzing at the periphery of my peace. Annual Lake Harmony Community Day. It proclaimed, with an agenda that included, inexplicably, a pontoon parade launch, BBQ, from my dock, my stretch of private shoreline. My cabin, a legacy of solitude bequeathed by my grandfather, a man who understood the sanctity of boundaries better than anyone I've ever known, was not, nor would it ever be, a public amusement park. I replied with a brevity that should have been unambiguous. Access to my property for this event is denied. That was when Carol Nesbitt, OA president, chairperson of the Committee for Making Everyone Else's Life Her Business, decided I was a project. Her return email dripped with saccharine condescension, something about community spirit and shared resources. Shared? The deed had one name on it, mine. I typed back, "The only thing I'm sharing is my refusal. Consider this final." She didn't. The phone calls started. Each one a little more insistent, a little more laced with the implied threat of neighborhood ostracization. "It would be a shame," she'd cooed, "if certain uncooperative residents found themselves outside the community's goodwill." I let her voicemail fill up. Goodwill was a currency I hadn't needed in years, not since the desert taught me the value of self-reliance with a rather more permanent curriculum. They truly had no idea who they were dealing with. They thought I was just another weekend warrior, easily cowed by the bylaws of their little fiefdom. They were about to learn about asymmetrical warfare, suburban style. The line wasn't just crossed, it was about to be obliterated. The morning of the community day, I parked my oldest, rustiest truck, a relic from my grandfather that still ran like a defiant mule, squarely across the entrance to my long gravel driveway. The "No Trespassing" signs, freshly printed in stark, legally unambiguous lettering, were zip-tied to the gateposts at eye level. I sat on my porch, coffee in hand, and waited. It wasn't long. Carol's minivan, a beige testament to conformity, pulled up, followed by a convoy of golf carts and SUVs laden with coolers and shrieking children. She emerged, face already flushed, a clipboard clutched like a scepter. "What?" she enunciated, each syllable a tiny compressed explosion. "Is the meaning of this?" I sipped my coffee. "It means no," I said, my voice calm, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in her eyes. "This is private property." "You were informed." Her face went from pink to a rather alarming shade of puce. "We have an event! The entire community is expecting this!" "You can't just—" "I can," I interrupted, the steel in my voice no longer sheathed. "And I have." "Turn around." She sputtered. Then, apparently deciding negotiation was beneath her, gestured imperiously to the small crowd. "We're going in anyway! You can't stop all of us!" And that's when they did it. One by one, they shimmied past the truck, ducked under the gate chain, some of the men actually high-fiving as they breached my land. Carol, bringing up the rear, paused, gave me a smug, triumphant smirk, and then, with the theatrical flourish of a pantomime villain, extended her middle finger. Then she turned and led her marauding band of picnickers towards my lakefront, my sanctuary, the place my grandfather built with his own hands. The air crackled. Not with community spirit, but with the silent declaration of war. They just signed their own damn surrender, and they didn't even know it yet. The flip of her finger, the deliberate violation, wasn't just an insult, it was a tactical error of catastrophic proportions. It was the spark that lit a very old, very patient fuse. My grandfather, a man whose quiet demeanor masked a will of iron and a mind like a steel trap, had a phrase for moments like this: "Time to introduce them to the consequence." I watched them set up their folding tables, their garish, inflatable flamingos defiling the quiet dignity of the water's edge. My calm wasn't feigned. It was the cold, still center of a gathering storm. I retreated inside, not in defeat, but to the armory. My armory wasn't guns. It was knowledge, and a very particular set of skills. Daniel, my nephew, a lanky kid whose primary interests were coding, drone cinematography, and a healthy disdain for arbitrary authority, was already on a video call. "Aunt Clara," he began, You will not believe the TikToks coming from Daniel. I cut him off. I need evidence. High resolution. Time. Stamped. Every face. Every vehicle tag that crossed my property line after my explicit denial of access and their acknowledgement of that denial. I need metadata. I need it all. His eyes, usually half closed in a perpetual state of teenage ennui, widened. Are we going nuclear? He asked, a grin spreading across his face. Thermonuclear, Daniel, I replied, pulling out a thick binder labeled Lakefront Property. Title, Surveys, Easements, Precedents. These people think they're playing checkers. They're about to discover I play a different game entirely, and the board is tilted heavily in my favor. The number 700 wasn't arbitrary, it was calculated. Per trespasser per hour, factoring in damages to pristine shoreline, emotional distress, and a punitive multiplier that would make their eyes water. This wasn't about money. It was about a lesson. A very expensive, very public lesson. They didn't know I'd spent 20 years as a senior contract litigator for a firm that specialized in making corporations bleed when they breached the fine print. They saw a woman in a lake cabin. They didn't see the mind that had dismantled hostile takeovers and brought regulatory bodies to their knees. My grandfather used to say, "The devil isn't just in the details, Clara. He is the details." And I was about to become very acquainted with the devil in Carol Nesbitt's ill-advised little party. The HOA bylaws themselves were a treasure trove of poorly drafted clauses and overreaching assertions, ripe for dismantling. Their own rules, when cross-referenced with state property laws, painted a picture not of community governance, but of amateur despotism. Daniel, my digital corsair, was having the time of his life. "Got him," he'd chirp, sending me a file. "Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning poodles urinating on your prize-winning hydrangeas, Mr. Peterson attempting to hotwire your boat lift. And Carol Nesbitt herself, Aunt Clara, using your antique birdbath as a wine chiller. Each image, each video clip, was another nail." The sheer audacity was breathtaking, but also, strategically, a gift. They were documenting their own culpability with an almost gleeful abandon. My kitchen table transformed into a war room. Maps of my property were overlaid with ingress points. Timelines were constructed with forensic precision. Every piece of correspondence, every ignored warning was cataloged, cross-referenced. The surgical precision wasn't just a metaphor, it was a methodology. I was dissecting their arrogance, layer by layer, preparing to expose the rotten core. The air in my cabin, usually smelling of pine and old books, now carried the faint metallic scent of impending justice. It was a familiar aroma. The evidence accumulated into a damning mountain. Daniel's drone, christened Icarus with a touch of his typical dramatic flair, had captured everything. The initial breach, the setup of the unauthorized party, the duration of the occupation, even the casual littering as they departed hours later, leaving behind a trail of plastic cups and greasy napkins. He'd even managed to get clear shots of license plates, cross-referencing them with the HOA member directory he'd acquired. "Aunt Clara," he said, eyes gleaming, "their digital footprint is a disaster area. They posted selfies, on your property, tagged, bragging about reclaiming the lakefront for the community." His conspiracy theorist streak, usually a source of mild amusement, proved invaluable. He found forum posts where Carol had openly discussed her intention to make an example of uncooperative residents, specifically mentioning my cabin as a prime location for their event weeks before the official, and subsequently denied, request. This wasn't just trespass. This was premeditated, orchestrated defiance. Each piece of information was meticulously entered into a spreadsheet, each digital file backed up in triplicate. The legal filings began to take shape, not as a scattergun blast of anger, but as a precisely aimed sniper shot. The claim wasn't just for trespass. It was for damages, for the flagrant disregard of clearly communicated legal boundaries, for the intentional infliction of emotional distress. My grandfather's sanctuary violated. The numbers escalated with each documented infraction. The 700 wasn't just a figure plucked from the air. It was the sum of their arrogance, tallied with cold, hard calculation. It was the price of their little rebellion. My old colleague, Marcus Thorne, now a semi-retired judge with a penchant for bourbon and brutal honesty, listened to my presentation via secure video link, his expression unreadable. Marcus had seen me eviscerate far more sophisticated opponents in court. When I laid out the evidence, the clear notices, the recorded denials, Daniel's comprehensive surveillance, the HOA's own incriminating digital trail, and finally, the meticulously itemized claim for damages totaling $700,000, he leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you always did have a flair for the dramatic. But this is a masterpiece of righteous indignation. Are you sure you want to pull the pin on this grenade?" I met his gaze. "Marcus, they used my grandfather's bird bath as a wine chiller. They danced on his grave, metaphorically speaking. This isn't about the money. It's about the principle. It's about the fence line. Some lines you don't cross." He nodded slowly.
"The documentation is impeccable. The premeditation is clear.
The sheer, unadulterated stupidity on their part is, well, it's a gift to any litigator." He paused. "The amount will shock them into next Tuesday. But frankly, given the flagrancy, a judge might not laugh it out of court immediately, especially with your name on the filing. You're not just some crank." He offered to review the formal demand letter before I sent it, the gesture I appreciated. It wasn't about needing his approval, but his imprimatur, even an informal one, added a certain weight. The letter, printed on the heaviest legal bond paper I had, was dispatched via registered mail, return receipt requested, to one Carol Nesbitt, President, Lake Harmony Homeowners Association. The clock was ticking. The fuse was lit. The silence from Carol Nesbitt following the delivery of the demand letter was, for 3 full days, absolute. I imagined the scene, the crisp envelope, the weight of the paper, her initial confusion, then the dawning horror as she processed the words demand for payment, trespass, damages, and the figure 700. On the 4th day, my phone rang. It was her. Her voice, stripped of its usual syrupy condescension, was a raw, ragged shriek. "This is insane! You can't be serious! $700,000? Are you out of your mind?" I let the silence stretch, picturing her, perhaps clutching her pearls, or more likely, a tumbler of cheap Chardonnay.
"Ms. Nesbitt,"
I began, my tone glacial. "I assure you I am perfectly serious. Every cent is accounted for. Perhaps you should have considered the clearly posted no trespassing signs and my explicit, written denial of access before you and your associates decided to host an unauthorized event on my private property."
But it was Community Day,"
she wailed, as if that were some magical incantation that nullified property law. "A community event that was specifically barred from my land," I corrected. "You were informed. You chose to ignore it. Actions have consequences." My deadpan delivery seemed to enrage her further. "This is extortion. We'll fight this. We'll countersue for being unneighborly." I almost laughed. "Feel free, Ms. Nesbitt. Discovery will be very illuminating. Especially those social media posts from your members, bragging about their little adventure. And the high-definition drone footage is particularly compelling." A choked sound came from her end. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had undergone a seismic reversal. She was no longer the queen of her petty castle. She was a defendant staring down a tactical legal strike. News of the 700 demand spread through Lake Harmony like wildfire in a dry August. Daniel, with his ear to the digital ground, reported that the private HOA Facebook group was in meltdown. Accusations flew. Panic ensued. Suddenly, my unneighborly stance didn't seem so unreasonable to people who had previously been content to let Carol Nesbitt run roughshod over them. Old grievances, long suppressed, began to surface. Mrs. Henderson, whose poodles had desecrated my hydrangeas, apparently had a long-standing dispute with Carol over the approved shade of beige for her mailbox. Mr. Peterson, the aspiring boat-lift hot-wirer, had been fined for a wind chime deemed excessively melodic. One by one, the silent majority, those who had watched my gate being breached with either indifference or quiet approval, began to find their voices. They weren't rallying to my side out of a newfound respect for property rights, not initially. They were terrified that the HOA's legal fees, or worse, the judgment itself, would come out of their dues, their property values. My solitary act of defiance had inadvertently ignited a rebellion. The local weekly paper, always hungry for a bit of suburban scandal, got wind of it. "Lakeside larceny, Ho slapped with massive trespass claim," the headline screamed, accompanied by a blurry photo of my gate and a rather unflattering one of Carol Nesbitt looking harried. The narrative was no longer about my supposed intransigence. It was about HOA overreach, about a community association that had, quite literally, trespassed into a hornet's nest. The public reckoning was beginning, and Carol was its unwilling star. The emergency HOA meeting was convened in the community clubhouse, a sterile, low-ceilinged room that usually hosted bingo nights and uninspired potlucks. Tonight, the air was thick with a tension you could cut with a dull butter knife. I sat in the back, a silent observer, Daniel beside me with his laptop, ostensibly taking notes, but more likely live-streaming the chaos to a select, appreciative audience. Carol Nesbitt stood at the flimsy lectern, her face pale, her usual bluster deflated. She attempted to frame the situation as an attack on the community, a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by a litigious recluse. The murmurs started then, low at first, then growing louder. "Misunderstanding? You let us onto her land after she told you no." $700,000, Carol. Where is that supposed to come from? "My dues better not go up because of your personal vendetta." Then Miss Abernathy, a quiet accountant who usually faded into the wallpaper, stood up. "Ms. Nesbitt," he said, his voice surprisingly firm. "I have reviewed the documentation provided by Ms. James," he nodded respectfully in my direction, "which she, very transparently, shared with several concerned homeowners. The evidence of premeditated trespass is overwhelming. Your actions, not hers, have exposed this entire association to significant financial and legal peril." The dam broke. One by one, residents stood, not to defend Carol, but to demand accountability. It was a public flaying, delivered not with overt aggression, but with the weary, resentful anger of people pushed too far. My monologue came not in a dramatic courtroom speech, but in the cold, hard facts laid bare by others, by the community itself, finally holding its self-appointed empress to account. She looked trapped, her eyes darting around the room, finding no allies, only accusing stares. The poetic justice was almost too perfect. The aftermath was swift and brutal, in a quiet, suburban sort of way. Carol Nesbitt resigned as HOA president within the week, citing personal reasons. The $700,000 claim? We settled. Not for the full amount, that was never the primary objective. We settled for a sum that covered my legal costs, a substantial donation to the local land conservancy in my grandfather's name, and a public, written apology from the HOA, acknowledging the trespass and affirming the sanctity of private property rights within Lake Harmony. More importantly, the HOA bylaws were rewritten, with specific clauses preventing the kind of overreach that had led to this debacle. My fence, once a point of contention, became a symbol, not of defiance, but of clearly defined, respected boundaries. The porch light which I'd kept off during the height of the conflict now cast a warm, welcoming glow each evening, a beacon of reclaimed peace. Daniel, my tech-savvy sidekick, became a minor local legend, the kid who helped bring down the HOA tyrant. He even got a few freelance gigs out of it, filming weddings with Icarus. The locked gate at the end of my driveway no longer felt like a barricade, but a quiet assertion of sovereignty. There was a somber resilience in the air, the knowledge that peace, once lost, had been fought for and restored. The moral cost had been their public humiliation and the dismantling of their petty tyranny. My victory wasn't loud or triumphant in the traditional sense. It was the cold, calculated vengeance of a warrior who preferred peace but was always prepared for war. The blood, in this instance, was entirely metaphorical, spilled across balance sheets and reputations, a stain they wouldn't easily wash away. And the lesson, I hoped, would last for a very long time. Don't mess with a woman who understands both the law and the unyielding defense of her own ground.